So OpenAI have just brought out their own AI-powered browser, just months after Perplexity brought theirs out. Many people online have tried to claim that this is the start of a new browser war, or that Google is suddenly going to get dethroned, and we actually saw a huge amount, billions in fact, of their value as a company collapse in the space of just 48 hours. As always, there's been lots of hype with this new release, and in today's episode I'm going to break down what I really think about it, and why I do not think this browser is going to take on Google. This is In the Loop with Jack Horton. I hope you enjoy the show. So as the title and intro, I think, of this episode explains, I don't actually think OpenAI's browser called Atlas or the Perplexity browser is going to dethrone Chrome. You know, I don't think it's going to capture even 20% of the market. And I may look back in 6, 12, 18 months, 3 years and eat my words, but I don't even think it's going to become part of most people's process or daily workflows. But in many ways, I also think that's the wrong way of looking at it. And it's definitely the wrong question, because I don't think that question should be, is this going to beat Chrome? And I think the more useful question is, does Atlas solve specific problems we have today? And I guess, what can you learn about testing it? So when Atlas launched just over a week ago, Google's stock price plummeted. It closed about 2% down overall. At one point, it dropped by 4.8%. You know, some people just made a lot of money very quickly if they bought at the dip. But that's roughly $18 billion in market value that just vanished overnight. And, you know, headlines have been talking about the return of the browser wars. But within 48 hours, it's been confirmed by TechCrunch and many others that Atlas is actually built on Cranium, which is Google's open source infrastructure for building web browsers. I'll get into why I think this is really important in more depth throughout the episode. But it just shows I don't think OpenAI is even competing with Chrome at an infrastructure level. They're trying to build this new interface into the internet. So before we really get into the meat and potatoes of the discussion today, I think it's worth summarizing what Atlas is, what they're doing differently, whether or not you should even pay any attention. So when this was actually launched, Sam Altman described Atlas as basically representing this like rare once in a decade opportunity to rethink what browsers could ultimately be. And the actual product itself centers on really two main capabilities and features, which is context-aware ChatGPT integration and its agent mode. So that context-aware piece basically means that ChatGPT lives in the sidebar of Atlas, which is very similar to what Perplexity did with their browser called Comet. And it essentially means that as you speak to ChatGPT in this sidebar, it understands what's on the screen and I guess understands the context of what you're talking about. So essentially, it's just removing the need to copy and paste. So if you're looking at a web page and you say and ask a question, it already knows what you're referring to on that web page. So it's not entirely new technology, as I said. Perplexity launched it in July, which has many similar features, but the integration with ChatGPT obviously means that that browser, Atlas, is now in the hands of potentially 800 million users, because that's how many people use OpenAI's ChatGPT every single week. Now, agent mode is where things could get both interesting, but for me, I found quite challenging. OpenAI tried to pitch it as ChatGPT being able to take actions on your behalf inside the browser. And the examples they included are kind of like, go do my shopping, or adding recipe ingredients to a cart, or placing specific orders for specific things, or researching competitors and compelling insights and putting them into a document. You know, and there's a lot of mixed results from people online and early testers, and definitely from myself. For example, one security researcher called Simon Williamson wrote that actually watching agent mode, felt like watching a toddler try and use a computer for the first time, but actually realized that you could very easily inject prompts and sabotage the browser and the agent whilst it's performing tasks. So it's actually a big security concern. Also, there's many reports on how it's just incredibly slow, it gets stuck in loops, and sometimes just fails at very simple tasks that would have taken a human less than 30 seconds to complete themselves. And that's definitely been my experience. I've not really been a fan of it, to be honest, so far. I hope it gets better, because it definitely represents some really cool ideas. But as I've said in previous episodes, it taking control of the screen just feels a little bit pointless when you just use APIs. So transferring data behind the scenes for you between agents. It's just quicker. It's the type of experience that I look for, not this, clunky browser that pops up with an agent confused trying to navigate websites. But that's quite a pessimistic view on this new capability, of course. They've also added a memory feature. Atlas, so the browser Atlas, now starts to track your browsing behavior and, of course, build up more context over time. And according to OpenAI, this will enable you to search and say, find all the job postings I looked at last week, or summarize all the industry trends and reports that I've been reading over the past month. And obviously that means it's just very personalized. And the trade-off obviously being massive privacy implications. I know I've said this again, and I'll keep on saying it. I have a tinfoil hat at times, and I'm going to put it on when ChatGPT is using my conversation history, some of which might be private. It's using its memory about all the things that I've talked about. It's maybe using context I provided to it in the form of files and documents. I don't want it to use that to sell more things to me and advertise more things to me, to be honest. Now, if we actually then look at what's working with today's early users, so the context-aware assistant definitely helps with some things. I've definitely enjoyed using it in some tasks. Now, it's only available for Mac users, so sorry everyone that's on Windows. Windows is rubbish anyway, so I know it's a lesson there. But there's been lots of people on Twitter basically getting Atlas to help with improving landing pages, suggesting improved thumbnails, all without kind of switching context, so just setting it a task in the browser and it doing it. Another Twitter user called Raza Martin actually compared both Atlas from OpenAI and Comet from Perplexity on specific tasks, such as tracking her daughter's school assignments across many different classes, and apparently reported that Atlas completed it much more accurately, whilst Comet really struggled. Now, I do recommend you guys go test it, and if you're going to go test it, I'd approach it somewhat systematically. It's quite a big ask to change browsers, actually. It's a weird one. It's like trying to change mobile phone providers. There's definitely for me, a resistance to doing it. I'm so used to using certain things over others, even as somebody that's quite an early adopter of new technologies. But if you do want to test it, I'd recommend trying it for a few days to maybe a week and trying to focus on specific things that you would use that context-aware sidebar for. So without touching agent mode, draft social media posts using this information, i.e. the web page, or use this page to write a summary email and send it to John, or improve my presentation that I'm working on right now. You could also maybe use it for learning. On YouTube, you can ask questions about what's on the YouTube video. You could ask clarifying questions about what you're reading without obviously having to explain or put web pages and provide any context. And then obviously later, I'd recommend trying agents, probably for low friction or quite simple tasks. So form filling, basic research asks like find the top 5 articles about X maybe some form of data collection across different websites or simple comparisons. And you want to be watching for how quickly the agent can complete that task versus you just doing it yourself. So yeah, have a test of it and try to take away learnings about the future direction of this space, but also whether you can imagine using this on a day-to-day basis. Anyway, now we've gone into, I guess, what ChatGPT is, the new features and capabilities. Let's spend a minute discussing, I guess, that strategic context because I think understanding why Atlas exists and I guess the constraints it's going to have to operate under will give us quite a good indication about how successful it is. And you'll probably start to see what I think around OpenAI not becoming the go-to browser and dethroning Chrome. So from a technical point of view, Cranium, so the infrastructure provided and built by Google to allow other companies to build web browsers, that's Cranium, powers about 83% of global browsers as of 2025. So Atlas runs on Cranium, so does Edge, Brave, Opera, Arc. The exceptions are literally only Safari, which has 16% market share, and Firefox at 2.37% market share. What I think is quite interesting is that OpenAI have hired Ben Guja as Atlas's head of engineering. And for context of why this is important, Guja built Firefox at Mozilla and then Chrome at Google. So his third big browser project, he chose to build on top of Cranium, so Google's open source infrastructure for building new web browsers, rather than creating a new engine. Even Microsoft couldn't justify fighting this fight. They spent many years developing what's called Edge HTML, which is, I guess, their own proprietary browser infrastructure. And you can guess what happened. In December 2018, Microsoft announced they were giving up on the Edge HTML project and switching to Cranium. And by January 2020, that transition is done. So that's one of the biggest, wealthiest technology providers in the world with almost unlimited resources, really, looked at that competitive landscape and say, we're not really going to invest here. We don't think we can win. Building a browser engine is difficult and very expensive and arguably difficult to have any real IP or competitive advantage by owning that infrastructure layer. You have to build rendering pipelines, JavaScript interpreters, implementing thousands and many thousands of web standards, handling security updates, maintaining compatibility across different devices and operating systems. The cost is just astronomical, and the use cases that you have to get right is also astronomical. And Microsoft obviously did the math and thought, there's no point doing this. Now, coming back to Ben Guja and why I think this is especially interesting, on top of the fact that he chose to use Cranium. Now, there are many different ways to interpret this decision. One perspective might be that building a browser or a browser infrastructure from scratch would require hundreds of millions of dollars and years of development and deliver very limited additional value to any users. But by building on Cranium, OpenAI can just focus on the AI integration, which is the actual innovation here. And that's arguably smart resource allocation. Another perspective is that it creates a big structural dependency on Google's infrastructure while really just trying to compete at an application layer. Every Cranium update would favor Chrome, which obviously is a massive strategic vulnerability. And I think both perspectives capture something real and important. And the real question is, which dynamic will prove more important to success? And I think there's definitely an argument to say that OpenAI's financial situation is a driver here. Because OpenAI are going to lose $44 billion between now and 2029. Before maybe reaching profitability. And only about 5% of their 800 million users actually pay for subscriptions. And Sam Altman, in a Fortune interview, actually acknowledged that they're losing money on a $200 a month pro subscription because the amount of usage exceeds their initial projections. So another interpretation is that OpenAI is investing very heavily in its growth phase, similar to how Amazon operated at a loss for years and Uber and many big companies. And obviously, therefore, Atlas could be a very clever distribution strategy to 800 million users. But you could also argue that the amount of financial pressure on OpenAI is leading to strategies which are a bit pointless. A good example of this is Sam Altman described advertising as a complete last resort at a Harvard Business School interview in May 2024. Yet by 2025 of this year, he's been telling Strateries, so an advertising media platform led by someone called Ben Thompson, saying that he loves Instagram ads. And Adweek reported that OpenAI hired one of Google's ex-head of search advertising as the VP in May 2025. And apparently OpenAI are targeting about $1 billion in advertising revenue by 2026. Maybe this just shows that they're burning so much cash, they're maybe pivoting to other revenue models to cover costs. It wouldn't be that surprising as a consumer platform scales. It often adds advertising revenues to its business model. And time will tell which interpretation matters. But also there are some points on data collection and context capturing that maybe highlight why they've done this as well. The Perplexity CEO has said very explicitly that the reason that AI companies are producing browsers is because they want more context and data on you. Because they want to know what hotels you're buying, what restaurants you're going to, what you look at on the internet. Because it tells them more about you. And they say to personalize interactions. And it coming down to the killer point of why I don't think they can be that successful is just looking at that market structure, the fact that Chrome has almost 70% of market share. And the companies that Google are competing with are basically in Google's pocket. Safari has about 16%, mainly because they own iPhones, and Firefox has 2.45%. And we watched Firefox go from about 31% of market share in 2009 to 2.3% now. Google has invested very cleverly in bundling Chrome into all Android devices and throughout the Google ecosystem. They've obviously put huge amounts of investment into Chrome itself. Google also pays tens and tens of billions of dollars to Apple to have Chrome on every single device. And up to 70% of Firefox's revenue is coming from Google to use Google services. And even Microsoft, who have got lots of enterprise products, lots of bundling of Edge into Windows products, lots of marketing. They've only reached about 5% after years of trying hard. Now, this seems very doom and gloom, because I do think that Atlas could have maybe 1 to 4% market share, which you could say seems very small, but that's about 25 to 100 million users. And by many metrics, that's a successful product. So yeah, maybe it becomes this specialized tool for 100 million people around the world. Maybe it doesn't. But they've got a massive distribution advantage because they've got 800 million weekly active users there. And converting just a few percent would put them into tens and tens of millions of users, which they could monetize and generate tens of millions or billions of dollars. Now, I find it quite depressing. I wish we were moving away from an advertising model. It seems that it's creeping back as per usual. But anyway, let's pull this together. I think OpenAI's Atlas browser is unlikely, as I said, to achieve this revolutionary market transformation. I think mainly because I think just market dynamics, historical precedent, many structural constraints all point towards that outcome. But I don't think that means it's not worth engaging with. Market share and individual utility, I think, are two different things. Maybe Atlas serves up to 100 million users and becomes a niche product. Maybe it doesn't. But for you as an individual, market outcomes shouldn't really matter too much. What matters is whether Atlas solves a pain point that you have today more than your current setup. And the only way to learn and find that out is to go test. So give it 1 to 2 to 3 weeks of testing and see what you think. Anyway, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I'll see you next week.